special session of the Human Rights Council. Before we proceed, we shall first deal with the election of a new Vice President of the Council from the group of African states for the ongoing cycle, to replace our distinguished and dear colleague, Ambassador Excellency Tamim Bayou, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Libya. On behalf of the Bureau, I take this opportunity to express our appreciation for his valuable contribution and cooperation in the work of the Bureau and the Council. In its note verbal of 25th April 2022, the Permanent Mission of Côte d'Ivoire, in its capacity as regional coordinator for the group of African states, communicated the candidature of His Excellency Mahamadou Ka, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Gambia, as a Vice President of the Council for the period to 31st December 2022. A copy of the note verbal has been posted on the extranet. In accordance with Rules 9 and 13 of the Rules of Procedure, the Council will now proceed to elect a new Vice President from the group of African states, and I therefore propose that Ambassador Mahamadou Ka serve as a Vice President of the Council for the remainder of the 16th cycle of the Human Rights Council. If I see no objection, then it is so decided. Congratulations to the distinguished representative of Gambia, and we look forward to working with him. As announced yesterday at the open-ended informative consultation, the request for a special session of the Council on the deteriorating human rights situation in Ukraine stemming from the Russian aggression was received on 9th May 2022. The request, contained in a letter from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine, was supported by the following members of the Council: Finland, France, Gambia, Germany, Japan, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Marshall Islands, Mexico, Montenegro, Netherlands, Poland, Republic of Korea, Ukraine, UK, and USA. The request is also supported by the following observer states: Albania, Andorra, Australia, Austria, Bahamas, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Croatia, Cyprus, Czechia, Denmark, Ecuador, Estonia, Fiji, Georgia, Greece, Guatemala, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Malta, Monaco, New Zealand, North Macedonia, Norway, Peru, Portugal, Republic of Moldova, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Turkey. In accordance with Resolution 5/1, the Secretariat communicated the request for a holding of a special session to all Member States and made the information available to the specialised agencies, other intergovernmental organisations and national human rights institutions, as well as to non-governmental organisations in consultative status with ECOSOC, pursuant to the Council's rules of procedure. The online inscription for the list of speakers was opened on Tuesday at 4 p.m. and closed at 8 a.m. this morning. The speaking time will be 2 minutes and 30 seconds for Council members and 1 minute 30 seconds for observer states and other observers. As announced during the open-ended informative consultation on 11th May, the Bureau had agreed on 10th May to propose to the Council for approval a set of extraordinary modalities for the 34th special session, similar to the modalities that were applied to the Council's 49th regular session. The modalities were included in the annexes to the minutes of the Bureau meeting of 11th May. I wish to reiterate that these modalities, if approved by this Council, would apply exclusively to this 34th special session and should not serve as a precedent. Are there any delegations wishing to take the floor at this time on the proposed extraordinary modalities?
No veo ninguna.
I see none. Then can I take it that the Council agrees that the proposed modalities will be applied during the 34th special session under the current circumstances? I see no objections. It is so decided.
Me gustaría reiterar el hecho de que
I would like to reiterate that in order to ensure appropriate sound quality for the benefit of us all, proper equipment and connection must be used. The minimum requirements for remote participants are a USB-connected microphone, headphones, a strong and stable internet connection, and a quiet location. Remote participants who feel they may have difficulty in meeting these requirements are requested to contact the Secretariat. Please be advised that where sound quality poses a risk to the interpreters, they will suspend interpretation service. Participants are further reminded that in order to allow for full, accurate interpretation of their statements, they should speak at a reasonable pace. I would like to take this opportunity to ask for everybody's support to ensure that this special session is carried out in an efficient and dignified manner. I appeal to all delegates strictly to respect the speaking time limits and to adhere to language that is commensurate with the dignity that should be inherent to our discussions. I now have the honor to give the floor to Michelle Bachelet, High Commissioner for Human Rights, to make a statement by Zoom. High Commissioner.
Distinguished President, Excellencies, colleagues and friends, greetings from Vienna. Thank you for this opportunity to update the Human Rights Council on the human rights situation in Ukraine. This follows my last oral update to the Council on the 30th of March and my briefing to the United Nations Security Council on the 5th of May. My office continues to verify allegations of violations of international human rights law and of international humanitarian law, many of which may amount to war crimes. Since the fourth day of the Russian Federation's armed attack in Ukraine, my office has been publishing daily updates on civilian casualties. We have consistently stressed that actual figures are likely considerably higher, as our figures only refer to those cases that we have been able to verify. In areas of intense hostilities, notably in Mariupol, it has been difficult for my staff to gain access and obtain and corroborate information. The pattern of causes of civilian casualties that my office has been recording in Ukraine has not significantly changed since the last time I briefed this body. The vast majority continue to be caused by the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, such as shelling from heavy artillery, including multiple launch rocket systems and missile and airstrikes. According to our information, while such incidents can be attributed to both parties to the conflict, most of these casualties appear attributable to the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. Excellencies, last week my monitoring mission in Ukraine visited 14 towns and villages in the Kyiv and Chernihiv regions, which until the end of March were controlled by Russian armed forces. My team heard firsthand accounts of relatives, neighbors, and friends being killed, injured, detained, and disappeared. This was the second OECHR visit to these regions, and it pains me to imagine how many visits will be needed to document only a fraction of the egregious human rights violations that have occurred there. To date, over 1,000 civilian bodies have been recovered in the Kyiv region alone. Some of these people were killed in hostilities, others appear to have been summarily executed. Others still have died because of stress to their health caused by hostilities and the lack of medical aid. They have spent weeks in basements being threatened by Russian soldiers with abuse or death if they try to leave, thereby placing these individuals at severe risk from the hostilities. In the village of Yahitne, in Chernihiv region, 360 residents, including 74 children, and 5 persons with disabilities were forced by Russian armed forces to stay for 28 days in the basement of a school that they were using as their base. The basement was extremely overcrowded. People had to sit for days without an opportunity to lie down. There were no toilet facilities, water, or ventilation. 10 older people died. The scale of unlawful killings, including indicia of summary executions in areas to the north of Kiev, is shocking. While we have information about 300 such killings, the figures will continue to increase as new evidence becomes available. These killings of civilians often appear to be intentional, carried out by snipers and soldiers. Civilians were killed when crossing the road or leaving their shelters to seek food and water. Others were killed as they fled in their vehicles. Unarmed local men were killed because Russian soldiers suspected them of supporting Ukrainian forces or otherwise being a potential threat. And some were tortured before being killed. In the village of Katyushanka, Kiev region, a young couple, their 14-year-old daughter and a grandfather, were shot by Russian soldiers while trying to drive to their house. The parents were killed while the child received 2 gunshot wounds. Today we have recorded destruction or damage to hundreds of educational and medical facilities and tens of thousands of civilian houses as a result of the hostilities. Throughout the country, at least 50 Christian, Jewish, and Muslim places of worship of different denominations have been damaged. More than half of these have been severely damaged and cannot be used. Excellencies, the city of Mariupol and its residents have suffered unimaginable horror since the Russian Federation's armed attack started. I'm shocked at the scale of the destruction and the numerous violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law that have reportedly been committed in the city, including attacks against civilians and civilian objects. A once flourishing city lies in ruins. We estimate the civilian death toll in Mariupol to lie in the thousands, while only with time will the true scale of atrocity and casualties and damage become clear. Active hostilities are now focused on the Ashtoval industrial area, with residential areas of the city now largely occupied by the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. This raises human rights concerns of a different nature than those arising in areas of active hostility. I am relieved that over 500 civilians, including children and older persons, have now been successfully evacuated from the Azovstal steel plant and other areas following the joint efforts of the ICRC and the UN. Combatants that are over the combat by sickness or injury, must also be allowed to be evacuated to receive the medical care required by their conditions. Excellencies, my office is looking into allegations of sexual violence and has verified a dozen cases across the country. I am concerned by allegations of sexual violence that have emerged from areas in the Kiev region that were formerly under the control of Russian armed forces. There were instances of rape and murder of victims or their relatives. Survivors are often unwilling to be interviewed because of fear and stigma. Women and girls are the most frequently cited victims. However, reports of men and boys being affected are starting to emerge. The mission also spoke to people who are searching for their relatives and friends. It has documented some cases of Russian armed forces having detained civilians, mostly young men, and then transferred them to Belarus and then Russia, where they have been held in pre-trial detention centers. Overall, since 24th of February, we have documented 204 cases of enforced disappearance. Of them, 169 men, 34 women, 1 boy. The overwhelming majority of them by Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. Among them are public officials, journalists, civil society activists, retired servicemen of the armed forces, as well as other civilians. According to information available to us, 38 of them have been released and returned home, and 5, 4 men and 1 woman, were found dead. the real number of enforced disappearances is again likely higher. We have also documented 10 cases of possible enforced disappearances of people considered to be pro-Russian in government-controlled territory, which appear to have been committed by Ukrainian law enforcement officials. 7 of those victims have since been reportedly released. My office is also following cases of conflict-related detainees in government-controlled areas which raise fair trial concerns. Excellencies, the only way to bring a stop to further violations is to end the hostilities. That must remain their primary objective. However, while hostilities continue and for as long as they last, all parties must give clear instruction to their combatants to protect civilians and persons of the combat, as well as to distinguish between civilian and military objects. Those in command of armed forces must make it clear to their members that anyone found to have been involved in such violation will be prosecuted and held accountable. I urge both parties to the conflict to fully respect their obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law, including to investigate all allegations of violations, and above all, to commit to protecting every civilian woman, man and child, and those of the combat. Our common humanity demands no less. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señora Alta Comisión.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. And I now give the floor to Mr. Victor Madrigal-Borlos, Chair of the Coordination Committee of the Special Procedures of the Council. You have the floor.
Presidente, ¿me escucha bien?
Thank you, President. Do you hear me well? Yes, Victor. Thank you. Thank you.
Distinguished delegates, I have the honor to address the Council today on behalf of the Coordination Committee of Special Procedures. Since 24 February, my colleagues and I have been receiving information, each within the confines of our mandate, about the disastrous consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Every day, this information adds to a catalog of grave violations of international human rights law and humanitarian law. Today is the 78th days of hostilities, 78 days of utterly unjustified human suffering, days during which we have been forced to reiterate our outrage. Beyond our condemnation, these 78 days also require concrete action to end hostilities and adopt peaceful solutions. Special procedures mandate holders have done their utmost to raise the attention of the community of states to the crisis plaguing Ukraine and to make concrete public statements addressing the wide range of serious human rights concerns. Often, we have done so in cooperation with other UN and regional bodies, such as treaty bodies or other UN envoys or representatives. These concerted actions across the UN system demonstrate the urgency and seriousness of the situation, as well as our shared determination to contribute to a peaceful solution. Excellencies, let me remind you of the key messages issued by Special Procedures since 24 February. My colleagues and I remain collectively appalled by the aggression by the Russian Federation on the sovereign state of Ukraine, harming its territorial integrity, and we reiterate that the use of force by one state against another is fundamentally unacceptable and strikes at the very heart of the object and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations. The consequences of this military attack on the protection and promotion of human rights in Ukraine will be profound and long-lasting, and will cause immense suffering and irreparable harm lasting for generations. We are appalled by the disturbing reports of violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, which in some cases may amount to war crimes. As recently as last week, several of my colleagues expressed concerns at thousands of civilians killed and injured, and countless others living through daily bombardment and violence. We just heard from the High Commissioner the concerning indicia of hundreds of extrajudicial killings. Homes, schools, hospitals, care institutions, and entire cities have been destroyed. Mines and explosive remnants of war continue to pose alarming threats to civilians, including those remaining in their homes and those fleeing the conflict. My colleagues also have expressed serious concerns at the dire humanitarian situation, referring to internally displaced persons, the absolute majority of whom are women and children, who have lost everything. Many of them face shortages of food, water, basic items and energy, and lack access to health services and medication. Mandate holders also brought your attention to the appalling humanitarian situation of older persons and persons living with disabilities. They have stressed that they are often amongst the last to flee conflict zones and face many challenges during displacement, living in poorly equipped temporary shelters and struggling with chronic health conditions without access to proper health care and rehabilitation centers. My colleagues and I remain profoundly concerned about the safety and protection of everyone in Ukraine and the well-founded fear which now pervades the daily life of every member of that society. I've mentioned by some colleagues last week, alongside internally displaced persons in Ukraine, the estimated 13 million people who are stranded in areas affected by the conflict are experiencing acute risks as well. Their lives and security are threatened, and they are largely unable to access life-saving assistance due to ongoing attacks and insecurity. We condemn all attacks targeting civilians and call for them to stop immediately. The secondary effects of the conflict and displacement on food production, which are forecast to affect the availability of food in Ukraine and globally, is also a serious concern. Colleagues warned that with the Russian aggression, we are now facing the risk of imminent famine and starvation in more places around the world. Where the private sector may be concerned, be it relating to supply chains, production, or even technology, my colleagues have reminded businesses to ensure they are implementing human rights due diligence to prevent and mitigate the negative impacts of their decisions and to ensure that they're not causing or contributing to grave human rights abuses in situation of armed conflict. Several mandate holders have warned about the heightened risks of all forms of sexual violence due to the conflict and displacement, something that is very much consistent with what you just heard from the High Commissioner herself. Multiple forms of gender-based violence are being reported, such as sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual violence, including conflict-related sexual violence. Women and girls on the move experience particularly high insecurity and risk of violence, including trafficking in persons. My colleagues have also stressed that unaccompanied and separated children are particularly vulnerable to the risk of trafficking, violence, abuse, and exploitation. The lives of all people in Ukraine are in danger, including ethnic, national, linguistic, and religious minorities. As stressed by some colleagues, the conflict is indeed affecting regions where different ethnic groups have been coexisting with each other for many years. The war in Ukraine is life-threatening not only to its multi-ethnic nation, but also to unique minority cultural heritage sites all over the country. Colleagues have also noted with serious concern reports of people of African descent and racial and ethnic minorities being subjected to discriminatory treatment as they flee Ukraine. We recall that all parties should allow safe and unfettered passage to destinations outside Ukraine for all those fleeing the conflict, and facilitate the rapid, safe, and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance for all those in need in Ukraine without discrimination of any kind. Mandate holders are also profoundly concerned about the safety of journalists, media workers, and associated personnel in Ukraine who are carrying out their work under unprecedented conditions and are now at a very high risk. My colleagues have referred to numerous reports that journalists are being targeted, tortured, kidnapped, attacked, and killed, or refused safe passage from the cities and regions under siege. They also underline that propaganda for war and national hatred, which constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence, are profoundly harmful and prohibited under Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and called on the Russian Federation to immediately refrain from these unlawful practices. They also have noted that the war has further highlighted the risks of proliferation of disinformation, misinformation, and incitement to violence and hatred, and restrictions of lawful speech on digital and social media platforms as a result of their business models, policies, and practices. We call on the Russian Federation to immediately end its invasion of Ukraine to avoid further bloodshed and loss of life. We strongly condemn and remind that international attacks against civilians and civilian objects amount to war crimes. We urge the parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. All alleged violations must be thoroughly, independently, impartially, and effectively investigated, with a view to establishing full accountability of all those responsible. Full light must be shed My colleagues and I maintain ourselves ready to continue assisting this Council and the parties concerned. We're also ready to cooperate with all relevant mechanisms to ensure coordinated action towards restoring full peace and full respect for human rights in Ukraine. And in that context, we welcome the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry established by this Council and call on all to cooperate with it, something that we are, of course, ready to do ourselves. In that vein, we also invite the Commission to avail itself of the analysis and conclusions of special procedure mandate holders in the preparation of its own work, analysis, and conclusions. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your statement. Now I would like to welcome the three members of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine established by the Council. We have here with us Yasmin Yutsamnoun, Pablo de Greve, and the chair of the commission, Mr. Eric Mose. And I would like to give the floor now to the chair of the Independent International Commission.
Distinguished President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, I would like to thank the President of the Human Rights Council for inviting us to this special session. I have the pleasure, as just mentioned, to be accompanied by the two other members of the Commission, Mrs. Yasmin Kazumhur and Mr. Pablo de Greve. Let me first give a brief overview of our work so far. The Commission members have had numerous remote meetings, including discussions of relevance to the implementation of our mandate. On 27th April this year, the Commission participated at the Security Council Area Formula meeting about accountability for atrocities. As mentioned there, our purpose was to demonstrate in a visible way the Commission's availability to communicate with all stakeholders from the beginning. This week, the Commission convened in Geneva and held meetings with a large number of member states, NGOs based in Ukraine, and Geneva-based NGOs. We have also solicited the views of the Permanent Mission of Ukraine and the Prosecutor of Ukraine. The Commission has sought contact with the Russian Federation, and it remains ready to communicate with them. We have exchanged views with the High Commissioner's monitoring mission in Ukraine and with the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights on coordination and cooperation within the framework given to us by the mandate in Resolution 49.1. Given the presence of the mission in Ukraine since 2014, resulting in over 40 reports, we consider the contact with the mission of utmost importance. Considering the large number of entities that are investigating the situation in Ukraine, coordination issues were raised with several of the interlocutors that we met. The Commission, as stated in its mandate, is independent. It has no link to any particular country, party, or entity. The Commission will continue to seek contact with the parties to the conflict, with victims, civil societies, and other stakeholders. It will be necessary to build upon a broad range of sources that will have to be considered together. The Commission will consider the evidence carefully, giving particular weight to primary evidence and seeking corroboration whenever needed. The findings of the Commission reporting to the Human Rights Council will be based on the independent assessment of the Commissioners and their analysis of the information and evidence that comes out of their investigations. While not a strictly judicial instance, one of the Commission's tasks is to identify, where possible, individuals and entities responsible for violations or abuses of human rights or of international humanitarian law or other related crimes. The Commission intends to take a victim-centered approach to make recommendations about the full range of accountability measures. We understand that the budgetary process assigning the resources to the Commission is ongoing. It is important that the Commission is provided with sufficient resources to be able to conduct its activity in full, with the necessary staff and the ability to visit Ukraine and other areas where information and evidence is available. We have noted the draft resolution to be considered here today. The Commission will continue implementing its mandate in accordance with the original Resolution 49.1, taking into account the seriousness of the allegations that have been reported in relation to the events under consideration by the Human Rights Council at this specific session. We would like to use this opportunity, finally, to thank the Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for the support provided in this important process so far. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco.
I would like to thank you for your statement, and I thank the members of the Commission being here with us. We'll now hear from the countries concerned. I understand that the Russian Federation is not in the room. Therefore, I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, it has been 10 weeks since this Council discussed the human rights and humanitarian situation in my country stemming from the Russian aggression at its 49th session. These have been 10 weeks of sheer horror to the people of my country, 10 weeks of time of deep suffering for every Ukrainian family without exception. International destruction to everything that we have been trying to build up since 3 decades of our independence reconstruction. Thousands of people in my country have lost their lives, more than 200 children among them. Russian bombing and shelling have become a part of our everyday life, and even now, while I'm talking to you, sitting in my office in Kiev, together with thousands of hundreds of other diplomats, we are unsafe under such conditions and circumstances. Millions have left their homes, having become either refugees or eternally displaced persons. Dozens of cities have been leveled to the ground. Others have become unsuitable to live in. Over 500,000 of our citizens forcibly deported to the Russian territory with their whereabouts unknown. Torture and enforced disappearances, sexual and gender-based violence, the list of Russia's crimes is endless. In addition to that, we are receiving an alarming information from the human rights defenders about the use of Crimean jails for the Ukrainians illegally detained and forcibly relocated from newly occupied areas of my country, for example, from Kherson. And by the way, the Russians have already launched the new project. They have been cooking the new so-called Kherson People Republic by blackmailing people, by killing them only for the refusal to collaborate with the so-called newly appointed administrations, or Melitopol or Mariupol or other cities. This council and its member states have a duty and, I believe, moral responsibility, respectively, to act. In March, the council has adopted a resolution which has passed with strong majority, and I wish to thank its members and those who supported the resolution for this stand with my country, for your support, because this is exactly what we call fuel. This is exactly what we need to keep on fighting and to resist. Back then in March, we all took an important step aimed at ensuring future accountability of criminals for committing atrocities by establishing the Commission of Inquiry. Now the time has come to take further steps in this direction. The areas of Kyiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv regions, which have been under Russian occupation in late February and March, have experienced the most gruesome human rights violations on the European continent in decades. This has already been mentioned by Madame Bachelet, whom I met physically half a year ago before the invasion started, while we were discussing the Crimean occupation and the consequences of this occupation. And we never thought that we would find ourselves discussing these atrocities within the full-fledged invasion of Russia. Thousands of innocent civilians executed in the presence of their family members, women raped in front of their children, children raped in front of their mothers, like the 11-year-old boy who was raped in front of his mother. He actually lost the ability to speak after, and the only way how he communicates with the world are the black lines. And this is the first picture that he drew working with a group of psychologists who are trying to help him to recover. It is time for this council to say its word and to mandate a special investigation of the Commission of Inquiry into these crimes. And I therefore urge all member states to support the draft resolution, the deteriorating human rights situation in Ukraine stemming from Russian aggression, which will be presented at this session. At this background, the situation in Crimea is, of course, overshadowed by the new wave of military aggression by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. Ukrainians in Crimea are conscripted into the Russian army and forced to fight against their motherland. Refusal to be conscripted means jail and prison. They are deprived of their right to own land in Crimea, to study in their language, their native language. Their religious institutions are closed or arrested by the occupation authorities. The Crimean Tatar leaders and Ukrainian activists have been arrested or imprisoned for nothing and held in prison up to 2 decades. They have been allegedly called spies, saboteurs, and terrorists. Mr. President, it is difficult to imagine anything worse what has happened in now liberated areas, but the situation in Mariupol, I believe, is even more disturbing. The world has been shaken by reports of bombing of maternity hospital and drama theater. Events like this should have leave no doubt that Mariupol must be on the top of this council's agenda. The city of 500,000 residents has been turned into dust, but refused to surrender. For 78 days and until today, Ukrainian defenders at the last outpost of Azovstal steel plant are resisting against the Russian invasion and invaders. Dear friends, food security in Ukraine appears to be another deliberate target of Russia. The looting about 400,000 tons of grain from the temporarily occupied areas of Ukraine, the blockade of shipment from Ukrainian ports, and the mining of shipping routes endanger global food security. Russia, in fact, harms not only Ukraine, but the world population through its illegal actions. According to the United Nations, over 1.7 billion people may risk poverty and famine as the result of this Russia's full-fledged war against my country. Moscow's unprovoked war is a war against us all, and only with the world standing strong in solidarity with the Ukrainian people can defeat this pure evil. I thank you for your attention.
I'd like to thank the First Deputy Foreign Minister, Ms. Zavarova, for her statement and her participation. Now, before I turn to the list of speakers, I would like to thank the members of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine for their presence here, and that they are continuing their mission here in Geneva, and they now must leave to continue their work, and we really thank you for being here with us today. Now we will turn to the list of speakers. Allow me to recall the established time limits of 2 minutes and 30 seconds for council members and 1 minute and 30 seconds for observers. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. We'll start with a list of speakers for member states of the Council. And now I give the floor first to His Excellency Mr. Carsten Nembra, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Marshall Islands, on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am pleased to deliver this statement on behalf of the Group of Friends of Accountability following the aggressions against Ukraine. 77 days have passed since Russia's unprovoked, unjust, and illegal invasion of Ukraine. For 77 days, Russian armed forces have indiscriminately shelled and bombed populated areas of Ukraine, targeted civilians, destroyed and damaged hospitals, school, and other civilian infrastructure, as reported by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Bucha, Kramatorsk, and Mariupol are but some of the names now associated around the world with suffering and devastation because of the Russian aggression. We deplore the thousands of civilian casualties, including hundreds of children. We are appalled by the continued reports of the use of torture and other ill treatment, arbitrary killings and detention, and forced disappearances, and sexual and gender-based violence. These are actions that may amount to war crimes and other crimes under international law. Such atrocities, crimes are crimes against all of us.
The interpreters apologize, but the interpretation will stop because of the sound.
This information campaign is an affront to democratic processes and human rights, and requires all states to be vigilant in exposing the truth. We are gravely concerned about the devastating spillover effects of Russia's invasion on global food and energy systems. Least developed, lower-income and middle-income countries, as well as on persons in vulnerable situations in all the region around the world, will be most severely impacted. Excellencies, we stress the importance of preserving the long record of non-use of nuclear weapons. We call on the Russian Federation to exercise restraint and de-escalate its nuclear rhetoric. It is imperative that all perpetrators of violations and abuses of human rights and violation of international humanitarian law be held to account. Justice for victims is a foundation for future peace and reconciliation, and for the prevention of further atrocities. For this, the collection and preservation of evidence is essential. The Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine has a central role to play in this regard. We welcome the swift appointment of its 3 members and thank them for their update provided to the Council today. We encourage continued efforts to ensure the prompt and full operationalization of the Commission of Inquiry to investigate all alleged abuses and violations of human rights and violation of international humanitarian law and related crimes in the context of Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine. The group of friends also welcomes the investigation launched by the International Criminal Court and the recent report by the experts appointed under the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Moscow mechanism as critical steps towards accountability. Importantly, these efforts are complemented by national investigation in Ukraine and other countries, including on the basis of universal jurisdiction and by the work carried out by the OHCHR, especially the Human Rights Monitoring Mission Ukraine and civil society actors. Coordination of efforts among the different actors is of crucial importance. Therefore, we call on all those involved in the collection and preservation of evidence to coordinate proactively to ensure complementarity and the meticulous collection of the most precise evidence available. Finally, we reiterate the importance of comprehensive, verifiable, and transparent records of casualties in situations of armed violence and conflict, which can contribute to better protection of civilians and help prevent violations of international law. The process towards accountability will bring challenges, but we will not let others be discouraged. The group of friends is committed to information sharing, awareness building, and advocacy. Impunity must be fought, justice must prevail, and international law and human rights must be protected. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Estonia on behalf of a group of countries. Her Excellency Ms. Eva Maria Limets, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Estonia. Video statement.
The President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries. We welcome the convening of this special session and thank the High Commissioner and the speakers for their statements. It has been more than 2 months now since Russia launched the unprovoked and unjustified war against Ukraine in grave violation of international law. Russia has consistently ignored the calls by the UN General Assembly, this Council, other international bodies, as well as the order of the International Court of Justice to cease aggression and immediately withdraw all forces and military equipment from the territory of Ukraine. The General Assembly has voted in favor of suspending Russia's membership rights of this very Council, a clear sign that the world has strongly condemned Russia's actions, including the grave violations of human rights. Unfortunately, all this has not been enough. We are still facing one of the fastest growing displacement and humanitarian crises where innocent civilians suffer the most. We are seeing devastating consequences globally, including for food and energy security. Developing countries and persons in vulnerable situations are the most affected. As said by the High Commissioner, Russian armed forces have indiscriminately shelled and bombed populated areas, wrecking hospitals, schools and other civilian infrastructure. We are witnessing torture and other ill treatment, sexual and gender-based violence used as a weapon of war, arbitrary arrests, abductions, enforced disappearances and deportations, especially of children and their illegal adoptions in Russia. We are witnessing what may amount to the war crimes and crimes against humanity on a daily basis. We strongly denounce Russia's actions as well as the denials, deceptions, lies and disinformation. We also support the need for national and international transparent, independent and prompt investigations into all violations and abuses of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We welcome the work already done by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. We fully support the investigation by the International Criminal Court and other initiatives. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I call on France on behalf of the European Union. Thank you. President, the EU thanks the High Commissioner and all of the speakers for their reports. The human rights violations by Russia's forces in Ukraine, the images of incredible suffering in Bucha, Borodyanka, Ilorivka, Kramatorsk, Mariupol are engraved in our memory. They justify this special session. The killings of civilians, the rapes, summary executions, enforced disappearances, the suffering of children, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, the 12 million Ukrainians who have had to leave their homes show the scale of this war. The perpetrators must be brought to justice. The EU supports all measures to ensure that they answer for their acts. The COI and the ICC's investigations and the measures by certain countries with universal jurisdiction, all of these we support. We support the human rights observation mission in Ukraine. We condemn Russia's acts. Russia must withdraw from all of Ukrainians' territory immediately, fully, unconditionally. Russia must comply with its international obligations, human rights and IHL obligations. We call for the immediate establishment of humanitarian corridors so that civilians may go to the places of their choice. The invasion has severe repercussions for the entire world. A food and energy crisis is looming. Ukraine's farmers cannot cultivate their land. Russia is blocking ships transporting cereals from Ukraine. Russia complains of sanctions. The sanctions do not target food but makes an exception for essential goods. Russia chose this war, which has led to a spike in food prices, forcing people and regions into poverty. The EU is stepping up its multilateral action to support countries affected by this, opening commercial routes so that essential products may reach these countries, providing humanitarian financing for food aid. There is one aggressor alone in this war, Russia. It is not NATO, not Europe, not Ukraine. Let us stand as an international community in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and all those affected by the consequences of Russia's aggression. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. I call on Luxembourg. His Excellency, Mr. Jean Asselborn, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Luxembourg, by video message. Luxembourg aligns with the statement by the European Union. Luxembourg reiterates its unflagging support to the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine. It stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. For 11 weeks they have been victims of this unjustifiable war by Russia. Since the start of the war, we have seen the worst crimes, the most appalling acts, murders of civilians, including women and children, by the Russian army, targeted destruction of critical civilian infrastructure, including schools and hospitals, allegations of sexual violence, torture, enforced disappearance. These are among the long list of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law in this conflict. These are war crimes and crimes against humanity. There are many reports of such acts from the regions under occupation by Russian forces. After their liberation, this information reaches us. It continues to emerge from regions under the control of the Russian army and the separatist forces supported by Moscow. It is crucial that the Commission of Inquiry established by this Council be able to carry out its work in full independence in order to identify and report on all of these violations. The work of the international community in this difficult context must continue beyond investigations. Combating impunity is of particular importance. It is the responsibility of the international community, including this Council, to make every effort to ensure that the perpetrators at every level, perpetrators of these crimes, are identified and brought to justice. Luxembourg is fully committed to this context and supports all of the efforts underway, and particularly those of the International Criminal Court. The people of Ukraine deserve from us a clear, unhesitating attribution of responsibility for these human rights violations carried out within this terrible war of aggression carried out by the Russian Federation. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. I call on Saudi Arabia on behalf of the Gulf Cooperation Council.
Mr. President, I wish to deliver this statement on behalf of the member states of the GCC. The GCC member states have been following with grave concern the unfolding developments in Ukraine. We express our full support to all efforts towards resolving the crisis through dialogue talks and to continue action towards implementing agreements between the parties concerned. The GCC countries calls upon the all calls upon the Council to invite all parties towards calm and de-escalation and to resolve this crisis immediately through diplomacy and talk. Opportunity must be given to conducting talks that would be conducive to a peaceful solution to this crisis. We call upon all parties to commit to the IHRL, and protect civilians, particularly women and children, and to allow unhindered access of humanitarian aid. And thank you, Mr. President.
Shukran. Tiene la palabra.
I call on the United Kingdom.
Presidente, since this Council last met, Russia's unprovoked and illegal aggression against Ukraine has continued unabated. This Council has a responsibility to protect human rights around the globe, and it's clear that Russia's brutal campaign of violence against the Ukrainian people deserves our ongoing attention. As we meet today, we do so with the greatest admiration for the steadfast resolve of the people of Ukraine. They have not been defeated. Ukraine will prevail. Russia's aggression is an attack, first and foremost, on those people of Ukraine. But it is also an attack on the fundamental principles of international law and a clear violation of the UN Charter, the legal order that underpins all our security, all our freedoms. We have heard reports, yet again today, of horrifying atrocities in Irpin and Bucha, including the indiscriminate killing of civilians, of mass graves, of sexual violence and torture. And we have seen evidence of the forced removal of civilians to Russia by Russian armed forces. We have watched in horror the bombardment of towns and cities across Ukraine. In Mariupol, the attacks on the Azovstal steel plant, which left innocent civilians, including women, children, and the elderly, trapped for months without adequate food, water, or medical supplies. We don't yet have the full picture of the atrocities taking place. But already, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission has verified more than 7,000 civilian casualties, including more than 3,000 deaths. As the High Commissioner said to us this morning, the actual figure of civilians killed must be significantly higher and is still growing. All allegations of violations and abuses of human rights must be investigated thoroughly, and we support the work of this Council's Commission of Inquiry and that of the International Criminal Court. Those responsible for these crimes must be held to account. Mr. President, we cannot look away while this barbarity unfolds. We must show that the international community is watching and that we care, and that Ukraine will win. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra India.
I call on India.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have taken note of the updates on the human rights and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. India's position on the Ukraine conflict has been steadfast and consistent. We remain deeply concerned at the unfolding developments in Ukraine. We have constantly called for immediate cessation of violence and an urgent end to hostilities. Prime Minister Modi has reiterated this in his interactions with global leaders, including leaderships of Russian Federation and Ukraine. India continues to believe that pursuing the path of dialogue and diplomacy is the only way out. We have strongly condemned killings of civilians in Bucha and supported the call for an independent investigation. The situation has further deteriorated since the Council has last discussed this issue in March 2022. We support all efforts to alleviate the sufferings of the people of Ukraine. We believe that the immediate priority should be evacuation of innocent civilians from areas witnessing intense fighting. Mr. President, India has been sending humanitarian supplies, including medicines and other essential relief materials, to Ukraine and its neighbors. We support calls to ensure free and uninterrupted humanitarian access and safe passage for the people. The impact of the situation is being felt beyond the region. Oil prices are skyrocketing. There is also shortage of food, grains, and fertilizers in the world. This destabilization has burdened people around the world, especially in developing and least developed countries. We continue to emphasize that the contemporary global order is anchored on international law, UN Charter, and respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty of all states. We call for respect for and protection of human rights of people in Ukraine and reiterate our abiding commitment to global promotion and protection of human rights. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Informo que la lista de oradores.
I would like to inform you that the list of speakers is now closed, and I call on Argentina. Thank you, President. We have been following with grave concern, and we deeply regret the war in Ukraine, with its adverse impact on human rights, including the right to life, health, food, education, and housing. We reiterate to the Russian Federation that it must immediately stop the use of force. We strongly condemn the invasion of Ukraine and the military operations in its territory. And we reaffirm our strong commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, territorial integrity, and unity of Ukraine. We are appalled to learn from the reports of the Office of the High Commissioner about reiterated indiscriminate armed attacks against inhabited areas, killing thousands of civilians, massively destroying civil infrastructure, including hospitals and schools. These acts may constitute war crimes. We are deeply concerned at the reports of the Office of the High Commissioner on allegations of torture, summary extrajudicial and arbitrary executions, enforced disappearance, sexual and gender-based violence, and mass displacement of the population. We urge the parties, all parties to the conflict, to comply with international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international refugee law, and in particular the principles of distinguishing civilians and of proportionality and need in the case of attack. There can be no genuine reparation without accountability by perpetrators of human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law, which must be investigated. We must ensure justice and reparation for victims. We agree with the High Commissioner that all of the parties must guarantee preservation of evidence of violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, correct identification and burial of all bodies, and the effective registration of all deaths linked with the armed conflict. We call on parties to the conflict fully to cooperate with the protection mechanisms under the Council, including the Commission of Investigation, guaranteeing full unrestricted access to all information and to all affected areas of Ukraine. Thank you.
Gracias. Agora tem a palavra.
Thank you. I call on Brazil. Ambassador.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Presidente.
Thank you, President.
2 months have passed since the Human Rights Council adopted its resolution on the human rights situation in the Ukraine. As the conflict in the country has progressed, we have received an increasing number of reports of alleged gross human rights violations in Ukraine, in towns such as Bucha and Mariupol, and elsewhere. The claims are extremely serious and need to be immediately and independently investigated, which highlights the relevant role to be played by the Commission of Inquiry established by Council Resolution 49/1. We call on all parties to cooperate with the Commission so that it can fulfill its mandate and provide us with unbiased and accurate information on the human rights situation in the Ukraine. Brazil believes that the Commission of Inquiry should proceed quickly with its independent investigation and present early conclusions so that responsibilities can be duly ascertained. It is incumbent upon the Council to base its deliberations and decisions on impartial, objective, and verifiable assessments of the human rights situation on the ground. At this pivotal moment, we renew our call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint avoid escalation, and resume talks on a much-needed ceasefire, paving the way for a negotiated solution to the conflict. We appeal to all parties to guarantee immediate and unhindered access to humanitarian aid to all regions of Ukraine, as well as the safe evacuation of civilians from conflict-affected areas. We must endeavor to preserve spaces for meaningful and effective dialogue, avoiding measures that contribute to polarize the debate and exacerbate the conflict. In this spirit, we have decided to participate in the current HRC special session on the situation in Ukraine, as well as in other appropriate multilateral fora according to their respective mandates. Brazil considers it important for the Council to continue to monitor the situation in Ukraine. As a human rights body, it has a unique role to play in drawing attention to the plight of individuals affected by the conflict, irrespective of geopolitical or strategic considerations. To that effect, the Council can count on our engagement and cooperation. Brazil will continue to follow the developments on the ground with the utmost attention. We renew our call to all parties to de-escalate tensions and put human lives first. Thank you.
Obrigado. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I call on Germany.
President, Germany aligns with the EU statement. Why are we gathering here today? Is it not enough that we have looked into the war in Ukraine in March? Excellencies, dear colleagues, the very purpose of the Human Rights Council, and I looked it up again in its founding documents, is to promote the universal respect for the protection of human rights. The Human Rights Council is to address situations of violations of human rights. It is up to us, the members of the Human Rights Council, to look closely if and when there are dire human rights violations. And this is exactly what we are doing today. How can the Human Rights Council be silent when basic human rights of millions of people, mothers, fathers, and children are violated in Ukraine, violated by Russia during an unprovoked and unlawful war of aggression? We all heard the words of the High Commissioner earlier today, and I would like to thank her, and as well as all other briefers, for portraying the dire human rights situation and the suffering of the civilian population in such clear words. We must not look away. Bucha, Irpin and Mariupol have become synonymous for the atrociousness of armed conflict and for the suffering that it causes on civilians. As our foreign minister said when she visited Kiev only 2 days ago, those responsible must be brought to justice. We owe this to the victims. Those victims could have been us. Dear colleagues, why does this matter to all of us? Putin's war is not only an attack against Ukraine, it is an attack on all of us. Because Russia is violating our founding principles of international law. The UN Charter, basic international rights treaties such as the 2 covenants on human rights. It is the primacy of the law that protects all of us. If we do not stand up to these breaches of law, it becomes meaningless. It will not protect any of us anymore, and this will be the victory of the powerful against the weak. Do we want to live in such a world? With the war continuing every single day, the devastating global consequences of Russia's aggression against Ukraine become even more apparent. Food and energy prices are soaring, affecting countries around the world and causing even more human suffering. For all those reasons, we strongly condemn the Russian aggression as well as the disinformation campaign inside and outside its territory, designed to justify the unjustifiable. Mr. President, we stand in solidarity with Ukraine. Thank you.
Danke.
Thank you. I call on Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Lithuania aligns itself with the EU statement. We continue to see more and more Ukraine suffering from unprovoked and unjustified military aggression by Russia, its war crimes and other large-scale violations of the international human rights and humanitarian law. We have seen reports of mass atrocities and crimes amounting to genocide, committed by the Russian armed forces in Bucha, Borodyanka, Irpin, and other places that have now been liberated by Ukraine. The High Commissioner and her team have documented cases of arbitrary detentions and executions of civilians, enforced disappearances of public officials, journalists, media workers, and human rights defenders. In Mariupol, we saw mass civilian casualties, indiscriminate and targeted attacks on civil infrastructure, and the complete destruction of the city. Russia uses torture, sexual exploitation, rape, and other abuses, particularly against women and children, as weapons of war. Russia has forcibly deported around 500,000 Ukrainians, including 180,000 children. Lithuania strongly condemns the shameful Russian disinformation campaign to hide and falsify many of these facts. Moreover, Russian aggression against Ukraine has far-reaching devastating global effects on food security. Obstruction of Ukraine's seaports and transport routes for grain export may lead to famine in several regions of the world. Opening of the ports is crucial. Mr. President, the international community must seek full accountability for the atrocities in Ukraine committed by Russia and its accomplice Belarus. Lithuania supports the work of the Commission of Inquiry to ensure accountability for human rights and international humanitarian law violations in Ukraine. Responsibility for human rights violations, crimes against humanity and genocide is the cornerstone. Launch of the investigation by the International Criminal Court and national investigations applying universal jurisdiction are of utmost importance towards accountability. We are convinced that Vilnius communique of the 6th of May by political leaders and experts of international law will contribute to the creation of a special tribunal for the punishment of the crime of aggression against Ukraine. We admire the infinite courage of the Ukrainian people and stand in full solidarity with them. We reiterate our resolute support for the sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine and its democratic future. I thank you.
Thank you. Je donne la parole à la France.
I call on France. Ambassador. Thank you, President. It has been over 10 weeks since the aggression by Russia, which is unprovoked, illegal, unjustified, began in Ukraine. Ukraine continues to fight for its sovereignty and freedom. France reaffirms its full support to the government and people of Ukraine. It admires the heroic resistance. Russia has brutally violated the founding principles of the United Nations, non-use of force and respect for territorial integrity. The Russian aggression every year brings worse discoveries. The targeting of civilian infrastructure, the voluntary destruction of stations, schools, shopping centres. We see reports of mass transfers of civilians to Russia. We must stop these horrors, the killings of Bucha, the mass graves of Mariupol, this trail of destruction. The Council has already decided in March to set up a commission of inquiry to document the events, and we thank the members that spoke just now. It has our support, as does the inquiry by the prosecutor of the ICC. France nationally has also sent a team of specialized gendarmes to investigate the worst international crimes. Because of the gravity of these acts and the witness accounts, the Human Rights Council has once again had to assume its responsibilities, and justice in Ukraine and internationally will have to examine these crimes, which may represent war crimes and crimes against humanity. We cannot ignore the consequences of the Russian aggression on world food security. We must address this hand in hand in coordinated fashion. This is the meaning of the initiative by France and its European partners in the G7 to calm tensions on the agricultural markets, stand in solidarity with vulnerable countries, and continue to investigate in local agriculture. There will also be a need for more resources to meet short-term humanitarian humanitarian needs of the world's most vulnerable populations. France fully supports the holding of this special session and calls on all members of the Council to support the resolution to be presented today. It is the responsibility of this Council, and it is a question of the effectiveness and the future of multilateralism. France calls once more on Russia to end its aggression and to withdraw from Ukraine. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you.
Go to the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. President, and to the High Commissioner and Mr. Mose. As Russia realizes its military cannot defeat the indomitable spirit of the people of Ukraine, its frustrations have led to ever more egregious human rights abuses. We see this in the ruthless destruction of Mariupol, in the aftermath of Russia's retreat from the areas around Kyiv, and in the reports of torture, gender-based violence, and execution of civilians, particularly in the areas Russia temporarily holds. Older persons and persons with disabilities have been reported to be especially vulnerable. Faced with Putin's utter disregard for human rights and human life, the international community must continue to use every appropriate tool to make clear that Russia must immediately cease its war of aggression, withdraw its troops from Ukraine, and abide by the UN Charter. Today's special session is instrumental to communicating this message, and it shows that more than a profoundly consequential moment, worldwide efforts to oppose Russia's war and stand up for human rights, sovereignty, and territorial integrity have become a profoundly consequential movement. For our part, the United States imposed on May 8th visa restrictions on over 2,600 Russian military and other officials reportedly involved in actions that threaten or violate Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence. Included among this group are personnel who reportedly took part in Russian military activities in Bucha. Working together, we must sound a resounding message to those involved in this brutal war of choice and ensure accountability. The United States supports all international efforts to examine atrocities in Ukraine, including those conducted by the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and others. What's more, the Commission of Inquiry created by this Council will help ensure that Russia does not get away with its continued attempts to hide atrocities. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la República de Corea.
I call on the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of Korea is deeply concerned over Russia's ongoing military aggression against Ukraine and its devastating consequences for civilians. We hear daily reports of increasing civilian casualties and an alarming scale of displacement. Critical civilian infrastructure has also been destroyed across the country. All this speaks to the gravity of human suffering caused by this war. In particular, my delegation is alarmed by the reported atrocities in Bucha and other liberated towns. We strongly condemn such heinous acts, which are a clear violation of international human rights and humanitarian law. Targeted attacks against innocent civilians cannot be justified under any circumstances. In light of this, we reiterate our strong support for an independent investigation on these atrocities. Those responsible must be held accountable and brought to justice. It is vital that the Commission of Inquiry embarks on a full-fledged investigation with on-site visits. We also fully support the ongoing work of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. Mr. President, my delegation is watching with grave concern the evolving situations in besieged cities, including Mariupol. While we welcome the recent evacuation of civilians from Mariupol and Azovstal steel plant, there are people still trapped, being left without access to food, water, and electricity. safe passage to enable the evacuation of civilians and to deliver life-saving aid to those in need must be guaranteed. Mr. President, over the past months, we have witnessed unspeakable plight of civilians in Ukraine. This must come to an end. My delegation calls on Russia to immediately stop its military aggression and fully respect its obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law. With its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity, the Republic of Korea stands in solidarity with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Paraguay.
I call on Paraguay. Thank you, President. At the outset, we welcome the holding of this special session, and we thank the Independent Investigation Commission, the coordinator of the special procedure, and the High Commissioner for this timely information. We are gravely concerned at the situation in Ukraine. The Office of the High Commissioner has informed us just a few days ago of over 7,000 civilians killed as a result of the Russian operations, and we fear that the figures may be higher. Thousands of people, if not millions, have had to leave their homes and become refugees or IDPs. There are millions of children who cannot enjoy their most basic rights. Paraguay strongly condemns the massacres of civilians documented in places including Bucha and Mariupol. We call on the parties immediately to implement a ceasefire, and for Russia in particular to guarantee and protect the human rights of the affected population and to respect international humanitarian law, refugee law, and international human rights law, and in particular the Fourth Geneva Convention. The human rights abuses and violations, including in conflict situations, must not remain unpunished. And we support the efforts to preserve evidence and the efforts being made on the ground by the Office of the High Commissioner and the other involved organizations. And in particular, we are gravely concerned at the situation described by the coordinator of the special procedures, including the imminent attacks. We cannot allow these things to happen. States and international organizations have an obligation to ensure food security. Famine and hunger must not be the outcome of this situation of war and the suffering of the Ukrainian population. Thank you, President. Thank you. I call on Indonesia.
Mr. President, Indonesia deplores the continuing deterioration of human rights in Ukraine. We are particularly alarmed at the report of attacks against civilian and civilian infrastructure, including residential areas, schools, and medical facilities. Indonesia once again calls for the immediate end of hostilities and for all parties to pursue a peaceful resolution through dialogue and diplomacy. The safety and security of all persons in Ukraine remain to be our utmost priority. We call for all parties to ensure the safe evacuation of civilians and the rapid, safe, and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, the conflict in Ukraine is also causing immense adverse impact on the global economy, contributing to food, financial, and energy insecurity. Clearly, this conflict harms all and benefits no one. As President of the G20 this year, Indonesia aimed to ensure that the G20 remain a catalyst for the global economic recovery, and the conflict in Ukraine remains to be a major impediment toward this objective. Only by having peace, security, and stability can the post-pandemic economic recovery and sustainable development goals be achieved. Mr. President, the deteriorating human rights situation in Ukraine is a harrowing case study of how violence against a nation's sovereignty and territorial integrity can only lead to escalation of violence, destruction, and human rights violation. Indonesia therefore reaffirms its unwavering support toward the international legal obligation of all states to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other states. Any effort to undermine this principle not only undermines the integrity of international law, but also tarnishes state capacities to ensure the protection of human rights. The international community, therefore, has to move in unison to strengthen respect of this time-honored principle. Mr. President, we must not forget that grave violations of human rights are also continuing to happen in other parts of the world. For example, cities under siege, separation of families, destruction of home is also continuing to happen in the occupied Palestinian territory. The fervor to call for accountability for human rights violation, therefore, should not be a selective, but rather a universal call. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra México.
I give the floor to Mexico. Thank you very much, President. Mexico supported the holding of this special session in order to have a platform for dialogue in light of the deterioration of the humanitarian situation and the human rights situation in Ukraine. As we have stated in the Council and other multilateral for Mexico, peaceful means is the only way to resolve conflicts. Therefore, we will continue to work in favor to ensure that diplomatic channels and channels for dialogue are preserved between the parties. With this objective, last May 6th, we were sponsors with Norway of a declaration of the Security Council that supports the efforts of the Secretary General to find a peaceful solution to the conflict. We're very pleased to see that it received unanimous support from the members of the Council. We reject the aggression against Ukraine, and we're concerned with the information that is provided by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the UN monitoring mission in this country, which shows that at least 3,459 civilians lost their lives, including women, children, and persons in a situation of vulnerability. We're seriously concerned with the destruction of schools, hospitals, and residential areas, the theft of cereals, and the destruction of the infrastructure in the agricultural sector, as well as sexual violence, enforced disappearances, abductions of persons, tortures, and summary executions. These actions may mean that there have been violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Also, while we recognize the efforts of the Secretary General and the ICRC in order to ensure the evacuation of civilians from Mariupol, we urge parties to ensure an immediate and safe evacuation of civilians and the wounded in this and other cities of the country. Finally, Mexico urged both parties to implement an immediate and standing ceasefire and guarantee the full respect of international law, especially international humanitarian law, international human rights law, refugee law, and find a peaceful solution to their differences through dialogue. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to Japan.
Yes, Señor Presidente. First, we'd like to express that Japan stands with the people of Ukraine who are fighting to defend their sovereignty, territory, and their homeland. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a serious act shaking the very foundation of the international order. Japan takes extremely seriously the fact that the large number of civilians in Ukraine have been killed as a result of the acts of the Russian forces, and is deeply shocked by this revelation. The killings of innocent civilians is a grave breach of international humanitarian law and absolutely unacceptable. This cannot be allowed to continue. Japan condemns such acts of aggression by Russia in the strongest terms. The CIO, established by the Council under Resolution 49/1, is mandated to investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law, and collect, consolidate, and analyze evidence of such violation and abuses. The role of the COI is critical. We strongly hope that the COI will begin its work as soon as possible to uncover what has been happening in Ukraine and preserve the evidence. Japan will continue to do its utmost to stop the tragedy unfolding in Ukraine in collaboration with the international community. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Pakistan.
Mr. President, Pakistan reiterates its deep concern over the continuing conflict in Ukraine and its ensuing human rights and humanitarian impacts. We are grieved by the civilian casualties, massive displacement of civilian population, and reported violations of international humanitarian and human rights laws. We renew our call for immediate cessation of hostilities and avoidance of indiscriminate and disproportionate military actions. Respect for basic human rights norms and principles and adherence to international humanitarian law is fundamental to preventing further loss of life and mitigating the humanitarian situation. Pakistan remains a strong advocate for an early and peaceful end to this conflict through dialogue and diplomacy. We encourage continuation of ongoing diplomatic and mediation efforts, protection of human rights and immediate evacuation of civilians from the conflict zone should be among the top priority of such efforts. The international community must continue to respond to this humanitarian crisis by scaling up assistance for the affected ones without discriminating on the basis of race, color, religion, ethnicity, or nationality. On its part, Pakistan had earlier sent over 15 tons of humanitarian assistance for the people of Ukraine, including emergency medicines and food items. We are in the process of dispatching another consignment of humanitarian supplies. Mr. President, the conflict is also exacerbating the existing socio-economic impacts of the COVID pandemic, with energy and food prices hitting the developing countries the hardest. These cascading effects on lives and livelihoods of people around the world deserve adequate attention and redressal. Mr. President, Pakistan reaffirms unequivocal support for the universal and consistent application of the fundamental principles of the UN Charter, including self-determination of peoples, non-use or threat of use of force, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, pacific settlement of disputes, and equal security for all. We hope the Council's discussions and actions would help advance the cause of peace and safeguard basic rights, freedoms, and dignity of those affected by the conflict. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra.
I give the floor to Poland.
Mr. President, Poland aligns itself with the EU statement. Excellencies, 2 months ago, this Council addressed the dire humanitarian and human rights consequences of the Russian full-scale military aggression against Ukraine, appalled by the human impact of the hostilities carried out by the invading forces. Since then, the situation has critically deteriorated. The civilian casualties have been constantly increasing as a result of indiscriminate attacks or even of deliberate shelling of the civilian infrastructure. The Russian invasion forced more than 7 million persons, mostly women and children, to leave their homes. Numerous patterns of violations of international humanitarian and human rights law were recently identified by the experts of the OSCE Moscow mechanism. Some of these violations, including deliberate attacks on maternity hospital and the theatre in Mariupol, amount to war crimes. There is no doubt that the present grave humanitarian and human rights situation in this city, as well as the barbaric atrocities discovered in the regions of Ukraine liberated from the Russian invading forces, require an utmost attention of this Council. The evidence of massive extrajudicial executions of civilians, in many cases subjected to torture or sexual violence, should be promptly and resolutely investigated, with a view to ensure accountability of all persons who committed these horrific war crimes. At the same time, Further human rights violations have to be fully prevented. Poland strongly reiterates its call to the Russian Federation to stop the war, to withdraw all its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine and its internationally recognized borders and international waters, and to respect the lives and rights of every single person in Ukraine. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Montenegro.
Thank you. I give the floor to Montenegro.
Mr. Chair, Montenegro welcomes the holding this special session and thanks High Commissioner and the speakers for their updates. Since February 24, we have been constantly witnessing a massive deterioration of the situation on the ground caused by the Russian unprovoked, unjust and illegal aggression against Ukraine, which we strongly condemn. As consistently reported by the Office of High Commissioner, the scale and brutality of human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law committed by Russian armed forces continue to grow daily, and many of them may amount to war crimes. The number of indiscriminate killings and of civilians and casualties, as well as the large-scale attacks on civilian infrastructure, are grim illustration of the cruelty of Russian aggression. We are shocked and appalled by images and reports from Bucha, Borodyanka, Kramatorsk, Mariupol and other places throughout Ukraine that have been leveled to ashes and where the massacres have been committed by the Russian armed force. Around the world, some of these cities have already become synonymous with horrific crimes of Russian aggression, and we must do everything we can to make them synonymous with justice. The chilling effects of impunity are well known. We have to fight against this by serving justice and ensuring accountability. This is the only way to prevent recurrence of atrocity crimes and the way to help the process of healing the victims, their families and society at large. Also the path to genuine peace and reconciliation. It is therefore imperative that all perpetrators of these atrocities be held to account. For this, Montenegro fully endorses all measures to ensure accountability for human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law in Ukraine, including the investigation launched by the ICC, work of the established Council Commission on Inquiry on Ukraine, the OSCE, UN monitoring missions, substantive work in collecting and preserving evidence also remains crucial. Mr. President, the draft resolution before us addresses these violations with a view to strengthening efforts to achieving accountability and bring their perpetrators to justice. With a firm belief that we must remain steadfast and resolute in our efforts to ensure that justice is served, Montenegro has co-sponsored the tabled resolution and encouraged everyone to support its consensual adoption. If a vote is called, we invite all Council members to vote in favour. Finally, Montenegro stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and reiterates its call to Russia to end the war and to immediately withdraw its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Finland.
Finland aligns itself with the EU statement. Finland strongly supports this special session. The rules-based international order functions in holding accountable those responsible for the atrocities. We condemn Russia's illegal and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. We call on Russia to cease its use of force and withdraw its military forces from the territory of Ukraine and to fully respect international law. During the ongoing invasion, we have witnessed continuous atrocities, including reports about war crimes and crimes against humanity. These include arbitrary executions, torture and sexual and gender-based violence. The Russian army has brutally attacked civilians. Those trying to flee, those in their homes, schools, hospitals, and those seeking shelter in civilian infrastructure. Thousands of civilians have been killed and injured, including children. Persons in vulnerable situations have been left to suffer. The human and humanitarian costs of these attacks are immeasurable. Finland urges Russia to allow the safe passage for all civilians and the delivery of the humanitarian assistance. This Council has a duty to hold Russia accountable for violations of human rights and humanitarian law. The investigation of the Commission of Inquiry established by this Council in March has a crucial role. It can also contribute to the investigation of the International Criminal Court and other legal proceedings. Finland also firmly supports the investigation by the ICC and the work of the OHCHR monitoring mission in Ukraine. For the rules-based order to deliver, it is important to have comprehensive inquiries of the latest events in Kiev, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, Mariupol and Sumy. Finally, Finland fully supports the resolution presented today. Finland's support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity remains firm. We stand in full solidarity with Ukraine and its people. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra.
I give the floor to the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Netherlands welcomes the convening of this special session and aligns itself with the EU statement. These are difficult, disturbing and frustrating times. Many of us know people in Russia, even call them friends. All they want is to be a good parent, provide for the family, enjoy friendship, have a job, like ourselves, like my friends in the Netherlands or anywhere else. People everywhere basically are the same. The difference, however, is that they are part of a system that shows complete disregard for human life and dignity, as we again heard today. They are part of a system that allows its armed forces to commit atrocities and war crimes, as we again heard today. They are part of a system whose president endorses, allows or encourages sexual and gender-based violence as a method of warfare, as we again heard today. They are part of a system that endorses or encourages violence without any military objective, which is aimed at the destruction of people's souls, which is a violence against humanity itself, as is the war in Ukraine, a serious threat to international peace and security. And that is why, Mr. President, it is crucial that these acts of violence are addressed and adequately investigated. Mr. President, the Netherlands remain gravely concerned by the devastating effects of this war on food, energy and finance systems, which are likely to have the most impact on least developed and lower and middle income countries. In Ukraine, the destructive power of the Russian invasion is being countered by the power of courageous people. The victims and survivors deserve truth, justice and accountability. It is for this reason the Netherlands remains strongly committed to the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry, the inquiry into the events in the areas of Kiev, Chernihiv, Kharkiv and Sumy regions, and the ICC investigation. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra.
I give the floor to China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, on Ukraine, China maintains that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, including Ukraine, should be respected. The purposes and the principles of the UN Charter should be upheld. The legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously. All efforts conducive to a peaceful resolution of the crisis should be supported. Putting an early end to the fight is the urgent expectation of the international community. It is also what China is striving for. China supports all initiatives and measures that help ease the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. We call on the parties concerned to respect international humanitarian law and take concrete actions to ensure the safety of civilians and protect the basic rights and humanitarian needs of women, children, and other vulnerable groups. China has put forward a 6-point initiative on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine and provided Ukraine with several batches of emergency humanitarian aid. We believe that all parties should jointly support the dialogue and negotiations between Russia and Ukraine with a view to bringing about peaceful outcomes, so as to fundamentally guarantee the human rights of people of both Russia and Ukraine. The international community should create enabling conditions for the negotiations and do more to facilitate a political settlement, rather than lay down obstacles or increase impediments, still less to add fuel to the fire and escalate tensions. As no country can base its security on the insecurity of other countries, we should stay committed to the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, and build together a balanced, effective, and sustainable global and regional security architecture. Mr. President, we have noted that in recent years, the politicization and confrontation at the Human Rights Council has been on the rise, which has severely impacted on the credibility, impartiality, and the solidarity. We call on all parties to get back to and abide by the founding mission of the HRC, uphold true multilateralism, and work together to promote the sound development of the international human rights cause. The full text of my speech will be uploaded to the HRC extranet. Thank you, Mr. President.
谢谢. Tiene la palabra Nepal.
I give the floor to Nepal.
Mr. President, the continued deteriorating human rights situation in Ukraine, including the loss of human lives, sufferings, and destruction of property over the past months, is disturbing. Nepal reiterates its call on the parties concerned to agree on ceasefire immediately and urge them to engage in diplomacy and dialogue towards resolution of disputes through peaceful means. We view that the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity as enshrined in the UN Charter must be fully respected by all member states, and fundamental human rights of all people should be protected under all circumstances, while also respecting the international human rights and humanitarian laws. I thank you.
Thank you. Y tiene la palabra y aprovecho para...
I give the floor and I take the opportunity to welcome as a new member of the Human Rights Council, recently elected by the General Assembly. So I want to give the floor to the Czech Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Czech Republic welcomes the convening of this special session, as it is timely and necessary given the worsening human rights situation in Ukraine. The Czech Republic once again strongly condemns the continuous Russian aggression against Ukraine, a flagrant violation of the international law. Mr. President, we are alarmed by the dramatically growing number of civilian casualties. We are horrified by the news of an airstrike on a maternity ward in Mariupol, photos of civilians lying dead on the streets of Bucha, and many other documented atrocities, including reports of widespread sexual and gender-based violence. The perpetrators of these war crimes must be held accountable. Accountability is what the victims deserve. In this respect, it is crucial we all unite and work side by side, both in the international as well as in the national framework. The Czech Republic welcomes the establishment of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine and the swift appointment of experts. We are prepared to fully support the strengthening of its mandate as proposed in the new resolution. Furthermore, the Czech Republic appreciates the report of experts established under the Moscow mechanism of the OSCE, which describes clear patterns of violations of the international humanitarian law and human rights by the Russian forces. We also fully support the investigative work conducted so far by the International Criminal Court. In line with our national legislation, the Czech Republic has also opened domestic criminal investigation on the reported war crimes. Mr. President, we reiterate our call on Russia to withdraw its military forces from Ukraine's territory and to enable safe, timely and unhindered access of the humanitarian aid to all affected areas in Ukraine. We also urge all member states to unite and show support to Ukraine and the new resolution. I thank you.
Thank you. Y último orador del...
And the last speaker on my list for member states is Eritrea. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Eritrea expressed concerns on the ongoing conflict and its potential devastation on humanity and calls on the parties to find a lasting solution. Being a victim of several hostilities, my country stands with innocent victims of collateral damage, and the real solution to the root cause of the conflict is long overdue. Fortunately, the debate seeks to drag the Council from human rights warden to a political tool to substitute and continue the failed deliberations of the Security Council and other UN bodies appropriate to resolve the matter. The fact that the Council has never in its history took any action in all of the other similar situations is also worth mentioning. The convening of this special session and the draft resolution do not manifest any solution and defy a balanced assessment. It is with such robust understanding that we reiterate our principled position to reject the convening of the special session. The resolution is simply a repetition of what was already in place. It lacks balance and coherence with human rights principles. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Pasamos ahora.
Thank you. We'll now move to the list of observers. First, for the floor will be Austria. His Excellency Mr. Peter Lansky-Tiefenthal, Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of Austria. By video, you have the floor.
Mr. President, for over 2 months, Russia has been waging an illegal, unjustified, and unprovoked war against Ukraine. Our full solidarity, therefore, goes out to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian people. Almost on a daily basis, new horrific accounts of war crimes and atrocities reach us. The scale of the onslaught against civilians by Russian forces has become apparent in the regions of Kyiv, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy. We are appalled by the reports of sexual violence, torture, and massacres of civilians, including children, and the terror spread among the civilian population. This Council cannot remain silent in the face of these atrocities, and we owe the victims and survivors an independent, objective investigation. Therefore, Austria welcomes the proposal by Ukraine to strengthen the existing mandate of the Commission of Inquiry, which operates out of Vienna. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Romania.
Thank you very much. Romania has the floor. His Excellency Mr. Cornel Ferita, Secretary of State of Romania, by video statement.
Mr. President, Romania commends the convening of this special session. We are looking forward to the adoption of the Council resolution condemning the deteriorating human rights situation in Ukraine. We encourage all Human Rights Council members to vote in favor, reiterating this forum's strong stance in defending international law, including human rights and international humanitarian law, as well as Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We condemn the atrocities uncovered so far in Ukraine. Russia's unlawful and unprovoked war and attacks against civilians and civilian facilities in complete defiance of international humanitarian law must end. Our common steadfast support for Ukraine is necessary more than ever. No effort should be spared to ensure accountability. There can be no peace without justice. Our country is playing its part. Romania remains committed to help all civilians in need, in Ukraine or seeking refuge in Romania. We joined other states parties to the Rome Statute in a referral to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to investigate any acts of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide possibly committed on the territory of Ukraine. We support concretely other targeted international efforts to investigate human rights and international humanitarian law violations. Romania stands ready to contributing to this effort and to the rebuilding of Ukraine. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Canadá.
Canada has the floor.
Mr. President, Canada continues to be horrified by President Putin's unprovoked and unjustifiable war on Ukraine. The brutality inflicted on Ukrainians by the Russian forces and the disregard for international humanitarian and human rights law and human life is shocking. As we have heard today, some of the most chilling accounts of violations of international humanitarian law have come out of liberated areas in Mariupol. Russian forces shelled a theater in Mariupol being used as a bomb shelter, instantly killing hundreds of civilians, including children. They blocked civilian access to food, water, and vital medicine, cut off electricity despite freezing temperatures, and attacked civilians trying to escape. Let us be clear. Russia is solely responsible for this crisis. Russia has attacked one of the breadbaskets of the world, destroying Ukraine's capacity to supply the world with food and blockading its ports from being able to export grains and other goods. Russian aggression is impacting the rights and livelihoods of countless who live far and away from the conflict. We've also seen widespread reports of sexual violence, torture, civilians killed in cold blood and their bodies burned, and attacks on schools, hospitals, and residential areas. Canada and the international community will use every tool available to hold the Russian government accountable. We urge it to fulfill its obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law. We will continue to put severe pressure on Russia until Putin stops his war, withdraws his troops and equipment, ends human rights violations, and seeks a diplomatic settlement. Canada stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. Colombia has the floor. Thank you very much, President. The United Nations organization was founded with a clear aim to preserve for future generations from the scourge of war. Observation number 37 of the Committee on International Civil and Political Rights declares that wars of this nature continue to be a scourge of humanity and violate the rights of many and kill millions. We need to ensure that we continue to stick together in order to denounce violations of IHL and international human rights law. Colombia, as a group of friends for accountability following the aggression against Ukraine, fully signs up to the joint statement made by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Marshall Islands and supports the mandate of the Independent Committee of Investigation established by the Council. We urge the committee to share its findings with the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, as well as the treaty bodies with the relevant mandates and the special procedures that might be relevant in order to support the Ukrainian people in claiming their rights for truth, justice, reparation and guarantee of non-recurrence vis-à-vis the brutal aggression that they have been subject to. Thank you, President.
Yes.
Thank you very much. The International Development Law Organization has the floor.
President, the International Development Law Organization remains deeply concerned by the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The human displacement and suffering, the global impact on food security, and the risks of broader instability have been devastating. This conflict poses a significant threat to the rule of law and the international system. As the only global intergovernmental organization devoted to promoting the rule of law to advance peace and sustainable development, IDLO emphasizes the urgent need for the full respect of international law, as well as the norms and standards that characterize the commitments states make as members of the multilateral system. The United Nations Charter applies to all nations. At every level, it is critical that we invest in the rule of law. That means investing financially, substantively, and through a steadfast commitment to the principles it entails, such as inclusive governance, equal access to justice, legal empowerment, and compliance with international human rights standards. The rule of law is a cornerstone of peace and development. Over many years, IDLO has worked with the Ukrainian justice institutions to assist the government and people of Ukraine in their efforts to strengthen judicial capacity, improve integrity, and bolster the rule of law. Even in the face of this destructive conflict, the Ukrainian government continues working with IDLO to ensure that its judicial mechanisms can deliver justice. Such tangible investments in the rule of law are more important now than ever. IDLO is pleased to continue its partnership with Ukraine, and we welcome partnering with others to support rule of law engagements in Ukraine and globally. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Australia.
Thank you. Australia has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Australia condemns in the strongest possible terms Russia's unprovoked and unjust and illegal invasion of Ukraine. We are appalled by the horrific acts perpetrated by Russian forces, including torture, mass executions, rape, starvation and forced deportations. We are alarmed by reports of a Russian airstrike on unarmed civilians sheltering in a school in Luhansk, resulting in the deaths of around 60 civilians. The deliberate targeting of civilians is a war crime. We are also deeply concerned by the impact of Russian aggression on the global food crisis, particularly its effect on the poorest and most vulnerable across the world. We call on Russia to immediately cease hostilities and withdraw its forces from Ukrainian territory. Russia must respect its obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law and ensure protection and safety for all people, including persons with disabilities. The Commission of Inquiry will be critical to investigating and reporting on evidence of abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law and related crimes, including in Kyiv, Cherniv, Kharkiv and Sumy regions, and to holding perpetrators accountable. Australia's support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and for the people of Ukraine is unwavering. We join calls for the High Commissioner to report on the situation in Mariupol at the 50th session of the Human Rights Council. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Peru has the floor. Thank you, President. We're grateful to the High Commissioner for the presentation made and for the rigorous work done by that office. The Republic of Peru has noted that this Council has once again seen it necessary to urgently address the grave and persistent complaints of violations of human rights and IHL in Ukraine at the root of Russian aggression, which often have constituted and might constitute war crimes. We express our rejection of the indiscriminate shelling of inhabited areas, causing the death of civilians, destroying hospitals, schools and other civilian infrastructure. We're horrified by the growing accusations of sexual violence against women, men, girls and boys, and we reaffirm the importance of guaranteeing for victims of these acts access to appropriate and safe support services. We condemn the reports of summary executions against civilians occurring in occupied areas such as Bucha, and we urge that these and other events such as cases of arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance and the use of torture are investigated fully. President, we call for the strict respect of IHL and IHRL and that all necessary measures are taken to protect the civilian population. We urge all parties to redouble their efforts to find a diplomatic, peaceful and negotiated solution in compliance with the principles and obligations enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Ireland has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ireland aligns with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner and other speakers for their updates. Ireland is appalled by the scale of civilian casualties and destruction being caused daily by Russia's illegal and unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine. We reiterate our call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and withdrawal of Russian armed forces from within Ukraine's internationally recognised borders. The level of suffering being inflicted on the civilian population is unconscionable. We are horrified by the increasing number of allegations of sexual violence committed by Russian armed forces. We condemn utterly the use of sexual and gender-based violence, which has devastating lifelong consequences for individuals and communities. We stress also the disproportionate impact of the conflict on older persons and persons with disabilities. Russia's flagrant disregard for international human rights and humanitarian law must not be tolerated. Ireland strongly supports the vital work of OHCHR, the Human Rights Monitoring Mechanism and the Commission of Inquiry and other international mechanisms to ensure perpetrators of violations and abuses are held to account. It is essential that the Commission of Inquiry is provided with the necessary resources and relevant expertise to carry out its mandate effectively. The international community must maintain its clear and unequivocal demand for peace, justice and respect for international law and human rights. Ireland strongly supports this special session and calls for the adoption of the resolution by consensus. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ecuador has the floor. Ambassador. President, Ecuador would like to express its profound concern resulting from the serious deterioration of the human rights situation in Ukraine caused by the military aggression perpetrated by Russia, which we've condemned already, violating the independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. This violation violates international law and the principles and aims of the United Nations Charter, peace, security and the respect for the sovereign equality of states. Ecuador reiterates its call for Russia to end the military aggression in Ukraine and carries about the immediate cessation of hostilities, seeking a peaceful solution to conflict through negotiations which will allow restoration of peace. War is a complete denial of human rights, with devastating humanitarian consequences. The situation of the civilian population in Ukraine is deteriorating on a daily basis in an unacceptable way, and they require urgent protection, particularly for women, children, and people in a particularly vulnerable situation. We firmly condemn the violation of international humanitarian law and the repeated attacks against the civilian population, as well as civilian infrastructure, schools, hospitals, and the use of torture, enforced disappearance, extrajudicial executions, and gender-based violence. We reiterate the requirement for independent and impartial investigations which will bring perpetrators to justice and allow for effective reparation for victims. Finally, we urge all parties to fully respect international human rights law as well as international humanitarian law and the international law for refugees, and that access is guaranteed to humanitarian aid without restriction. Thank you. Thank you very much. Portugal has the floor.
Senor Presidente, Portugal aligns with the statements by the European Union and by the Group of Friends on accountability. Portugal unequivocally condemns the unprovoked aggression by Russia against Ukraine. The images and the reports we are getting portray a somber scenario of human suffering. We shall not forget the atrocities committed in Bucha or Mariupol, the indiscriminate attacks against civilian and infrastructures like schools and hospitals, reports of torture, arbitrary executions, sexual and gender-based violence and crimes against children. Portugal will support the investigations carried out by the Commission of Inquiry and considers the investigation launched by the ICC prosecutor a key step for accountability. Mr. President, military hostilities must cease. Humanitarian corridors must be preserved. Portugal will continue to welcome Ukrainians who seek refuge in our country and continue supporting Ukraine and its people. The Council shall continue to speak up for all those affected directly by this conflict and also for all around the globe and in other crisis settings who suffer the indirect consequences of this aggression. Gracias.
Obrigado.
Thank you very much. Latvia has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are appalled by the increasing number of reports of atrocities committed by the Russian armed forces. We strongly condemn forced deportations of Ukrainians to Russia, including children and their illegal adoptions in Russia. This is not the first time Russia has used forced deportations to decimate the occupied nation. For example, in 1941, the USSR forcibly deported approximately 100,000 people from the Baltic states, Ukraine, Moldova and Belarus to the far regions of Russia. Most of them died in exile. Latvia fully supports the work of all relevant accountability mechanisms, including the ICC investigation and the work of the Commission of Inquiry. We are also deeply concerned about the suffering the Russian aggression is causing in other regions of the world. The disruption to food systems and markets has led to decreased food availability and increased food prices. And this is not caused by sanctions. It is the direct result of Russia's blockade of Black Sea ports, preventing the export of tons of wheat, grain and corn. As long as Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues, food security worldwide will keep deteriorating. In conclusion, Latvia, more than ever, affirms its unwavering support to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. New Zealand has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. New Zealand associates itself with the statement delivered by the Marshall Islands on behalf of the Group of Friends on Accountability. We continue to be alarmed at the reports of egregious human rights abuses inside Ukraine and the worsening humanitarian crisis. Russia's blatant disregard for the impact of war on the lives of civilians, especially women, children and persons with disabilities, is central to this crisis. We reiterate our call for an immediate end to Russian hostilities against Ukraine. The situation on the ground is worsening. Reports are emerging of deliberate abuses of human rights in multiple towns and cities. New Zealand recently announced that we will provide $1 million to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to support ongoing monitoring and accountability. We are also concerned by and actively monitoring the negative impacts on human security and human rights beyond Ukraine due to food shortages and other flow-on effects of Russian aggression. We have concerns for the protection of the human rights of those people who have been transferred from Ukraine and are in Russia or areas occupied by Russian forces. We call for transparency and international access to these people. We condemn the use of weapons in violation of international law and norms, including cluster munitions, and categorically reject all threats to use nuclear weapons which would have devastating effects for humanity. We welcome also the call for the High Commissioner to present an update on the situation in Ukraine to the upcoming 50th regular session of the Council. The international community must continue to send a clear message to Russia. We are watching and your actions have consequences. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra
The Sovereign Order of Malta has the floor.
Mr. President, the Sovereign Order of Malta remains deeply concerned by the current war in Ukraine and supports the draft resolution before this special session. This tragic situation has forced 5 million people to flee the country while causing the internal displacement of more than 7 million. My delegation should like to confirm here our strong humanitarian commitment to alleviate the terrible suffering of the Ukrainian people. The Order of Malta, through its associations, relief and voluntary corps, and by means of its diplomatic network, is continuing to deliver relief and basic goods to the population in need, both in Ukraine and in the neighboring countries. Projects for displaced people targeting children in particular continue both in western and eastern Ukraine. Accommodation is provided to displaced people in Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk, and in Berehovo, the Order of Malta Ukraine manages a war horse in charge of the distribution of relief goods to IDPs, despite the lack of security and the difficulties of access. In Poland and Hungary, services for incoming refugees include shuttle services, medical points and food distribution. In Romania, Slovakia and Lithuania, the Order of Malta supports the relief operations by distributing aid. The Italian Relief Corps of the Order of Malta has deployed teams of volunteers to Romania. Many other national associations of the Order of Malta across Europe, let's mention here Germany and France in particular, but also in the United States, have offered support by organizing fundraising campaigns and shipping humanitarian goods. I thank you.
Nicaragua has the floor. No microphone at the beginning of the statement. The combat for peace and the establishment of a fair international order are essential commitments of the people of Nicaragua, and in line with our principles and our commitment to peace. Throughout our history, we have opposed all forms of war and everything destroying peace, harmony, and the violation of rights. that are deserved by all the peoples of the world. Our government and people have spoken out in international fora at every possible occasion their commitment to this the world over, and indeed the dialogue mechanisms available to support this, as well as all humanitarian efforts that must be shouldered in this connection and in neutrality in the face of conflicts which risk this global order. AGWA firmly expresses this view vis-à-vis the situation in the Russian Federation and Ukraine. This organization must undertake a constructive and neutral role promoting peace and security in all countries, avoiding greater tension. The events occurring in terms of violations of human rights, in particular the loss of life, fly in the face of the United Nations Charter, and the continued interventionist policies against states have exacerbated this. The coup in Ukraine in 2014 and subsequent ramifications have led to thousands of deaths and a series of events which have violated human rights the world over, and all of this to fuel Western interests. Thank you very much. Switzerland has the floor. Thank you very much, President. Switzerland condemns in the strongest possible terms the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, recalling that respect for human rights and international humanitarian law is incumbent on all parties. The Russian Federation attacked Ukraine with no justification. Justice must be delivered for the victims of this act, which flies in the face of the fundamental rules of our international order. All crimes under international law, such as those committed in Bucha, attacks against civilians in Kramatorsk station or in Mariupol theatre, to mention just the most notorious crimes, must be subject to independent investigations. The perpetrators of grave violations of human rights law and international humanitarian law must be identified and brought to justice. It is essential that this process be centred on the needs of victims. To this end, Switzerland supports, among other things, the work of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine and the investigations carried out by the ICC, as well as the investigating committee of the HRC. We call on all parties to fully cooperate with those mechanisms and to provide the appropriate access. To conclude, we welcome the positive contribution of the UN and the ICRC in the evacuation of the majority of civilians from the Azovstal factory, and we encourage that those evacuations continue. Thank you very much. Thank you. Albania has the floor.
Mr. President, Albania aligns with the statement delivered by the Honourable Minister of the Marshall Islands on behalf of the Group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine. We wish to thank the OHCHR, especially the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, for their work to date in documenting violations of international humanitarian law and violations of human rights law in Ukraine. The brutality of Russia's unprovoked, unjustified, and illegal attack upon Ukraine is shocking. This is Russia's war of choice, a premeditated aggression against a sovereign country, a choice to commit unspeakable atrocities, a horror story of violations perpetrated against civilians, in the words of the High Commissioner. Russian forces retreating from Bucha and other Ukrainian towns left a shocking trail of violence behind. We can only imagine the situation in besieged Mariupol. Russia's unlawful aggression against Ukraine must end. It is crystal clear that there can be no impunity for the torrent of atrocities committed against the people of Ukraine. The victims of Russia's illegality have the right to truth, justice, and reparations. The Commission of Inquiry can play a key role in advancing accountability in Ukraine, and we wish to assure the Commission of Albania's full support, including for the strengthening of its mandate. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra.
The Republic of Moldova has the floor. Video statement.
President, the war in Ukraine has been ravaging for 78 days now, while we are still struggling with just voicing the word war. The brutality inflicted on Ukraine, on its men, women, children, is outrageous. At least 226 children dead and hundreds wounded. although no one knows the real number. Over 2,000 children born in war in most inhuman conditions. Since the last dialogue on Ukraine, the situation has only worsened with countless violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. We are pleading yet again for the Russian Federation to stop its military aggression, immediately remove its troops from Ukraine, and respect international humanitarian law. The forced transfers of population, along with reported use of torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, arbitrary execution, or sexual violence, are deeply appalling. We join the previous speakers in urging the Russian Federation to share a comprehensive list of transferred persons and allow international staff unhindered access to those persons. To conclude, I would like to reiterate our strong commitment to accountability and support for the comprehensive and independent investigations conducted by the Commission of Inquiry. Thank you.
Perdón, tiene la palabra.
Mills has the floor.
President, Malta aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. For decades, this time of the year has been associated with commemorating a liberated Europe, embracing democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. Today, however, we are here at the Human Rights Council, again condemning the premeditated invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. Instead of celebrating the end of World War II and peace in Europe, we are remembering the innocent civilian victims of conflict in Kiev, Kharkiv, Bucha, Mariupol, and numerous other cities in Ukraine. For weeks we have witnessed the cruel onslaught in Mariupol, leading to wide-scale destruction of the city. Thousands of inhabitants have been deported or forcibly displaced. We call for immediate and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance by refugees and other displaced people. Malta calls upon Russia to immediately cease all hostilities, withdraw all its military from Ukraine, and fully respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence. We reiterate that diplomacy and dialogue must prevail, and we expect that international law, internationally recognized borders, international human rights and humanitarian law are fully respected and accountability ensured. Finally, we join others in expressing our full support and solidarity with the government and people of Ukraine. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra.
Sweden has the floor.
President, Sweden fully aligns itself with the European Union. Sweden stands in solidarity with Ukraine and its people. Our steadfast support will continue. We condemn the Russian Federation's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine in the strongest terms. It is a flagrant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. We also condemn the involvement of Belarus in the aggression. Russia must respect IHL. We have been horrified by recent discovery of mass graves, which bears witness to the crimes committed by Russia. Reports of sexual assault and rape by Russian armed forces are appalling. Abductions of local representatives are deeply concerning and utterly unacceptable. The repeated attacks against civilians must stop. We are running out of adjectives strong enough to describe the horrors committed by Russian forces in Ukraine. All violations of human rights and IHL must be systematically documented and investigated. We welcome the investigations of the Commission of Inquiry and the ICC. These and similar investigations are also an important deterrence. The world is watching. Perpetrators must and will be held to account. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Belarus.
Thank you, President. Belarus regrets that the tragic events and the death and suffering of civilians in Ukraine has, for a group of states, not a subject of a swift diplomatic settlement, but a bargaining chip in geopolitical brinkmanship. Now, this there's the draft resolution which points to this, which one-sidedly interprets what's happening in the conflict. We note with concern the worsening humanitarian situation in the country, civilian victims, devastation of social infrastructure, the ongoing practice of detention of civilians against their will in conflict zones. We are concerned by the fact that the conflict in Ukraine is turning into a lucrative business for a number of Western states that are lavishing Ukraine with weapons. The profits are being scooped up by military corporations, and it's pouring oil on the fire of the conflict in Ukraine, and it could be a trigger for irreversible human losses and challenges when it comes to arms control, regional security, and trying to combat international terrorism. This must not be allowed. In that regard, Belarus once ago urges the need to settle the conflict in Ukraine at the negotiating table. We urge for countries and international institutions to refrain from a bloc mentality and emphasize political diplomatic efforts and not to support war. Belarus is interested in a swift solution to the conflict in Ukraine and to facilitate a search for peaceful compromises. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to North Macedonia.
Mr. President, today it is the 78th day of the blatant and unprovoked aggression of Russian forces against Ukraine. The ongoing assaults have turned Mariupol into a ghost town, Bucha into a mass grave, and has forced a third of Ukrainians to flee their country or displace internally. This war is spiraling out of control. Every single death of a child is one too many. We are horrified by the atrocities of the Russian military and paramilitary troops against innocent Ukrainian civilians. We cannot close our eyes in the face of thousands of massacres, torture, and widespread reports of sexual violence, including children. We stand with the people of Ukraine and reiterate our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We insist that all perpetrators of violence and abuse of human rights and international humanitarian law are held accountable. Hence, North Macedonia wholeheartedly welcomes Ukraine's proposal to strengthen the existing mandate of the Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry. Excellencies, dear colleagues, can we erase the black color from the little boy's drawing shown by the Ukrainian Deputy Minister? As Martin Luther King said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Italia.
I give the floor to Italy.
Aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union and expresses deep concern for the further deterioration of the human rights situation in Ukraine, the increasing number of civilian casualties, and the ongoing humanitarian catastrophe caused by the unprovoked and unjustified military aggression by the Russian Federation against a sovereign country. The horrific developments and the unbearable human suffering recently documented by the OHCHR and other international organizations throughout Ukraine are shocking. The continued large-scale targeting of civilian infrastructures, including medical and education facilities, is unacceptable. We are particularly concerned by the situation of women and girls, children, persons with disabilities, and all other persons in vulnerable situations, as well as by the allegation of sexual and gender-based violence. These atrocities and violations of international law must stop immediately, and those responsible must be brought to justice. Therefore, we renew our strong support for all efforts aimed at ensuring full accountability, including by the Commission of Inquiry, the OSCE Moscow mechanism, as well as the International Criminal Court. We are also extremely worried about the global economic challenges and negative impact of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, including on food security, in particular in the least developed countries. Italy renews once again its call on Russia to fully comply with its obligation under international law, immediately cease all military actions, and ensure safe corridors to evacuate the civilian population. In conclusion, I wish to reaffirm Italy's full solidarity and support for Ukraine and its people. I thank you.
Grazie. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Denmark.
Mr. President, Denmark aligns itself with the statement by the EU. We reiterate our condemnation in the strongest possible terms of the unlawful Russian aggression against Ukraine. Every day we hear news of new horrific crimes committed by the Russian forces. We are appalled by the use of cluster ammunition and indiscriminate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. Crimes involve summary executions, torture and other ill treatment, arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearances and sexual and gender-based violence, and may amount to war crimes. We remain deeply concerned about the impact of the Russian aggression on food security and the right to food, affecting in particular developing countries. We call upon Russia to immediately end its violence against civilians and civilian infrastructure and urge the full and immediate withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. Holding perpetrators to account is important for prevention, the international rule-based order, and future peace and reconciliation. We must insist on achieving accountability and justice for victims. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Chile.
Thank you. I give the floor to Chile. President, I wish to start by recalling the victims of the brutal war in Ukraine, a result of an invasion which violates the norms of international law, of international humanitarian law and the UN Charter. The Chilean government wishes to express once more its profound concern at the armed aggression by Russia and the violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. The gravity of the acts require a swift, compelling response from the Human Rights Council and of the international community, cooperating with a view to ending the conflict and ensuring accountability. Chile categorically condemns the use of force in international relations. We reiterate the call for dialogue to reach a peaceful solution to the conflict as per Article 2 of the UN Charter. That's why we urge Russia to withdraw its troops, respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, and avoid the loss of any more innocent lives and material damage while respecting the Geneva Conventions. Chile entertains the hope that dialogue and negotiations will prevail to prevent a greater escalation of this conflict, which is a threat to international peace and security. Finally, we state the solidarity of the people of Chile with the millions of people in Ukraine affected by this war. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Mr. President. Liechtenstein supported the convening of this special session to address the deterioration of the human rights situation in Ukraine as a result of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. We would like to thank the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Chair of the Coordination Committee, as well as the members of the Commission of Inquiry for their respective statements. We are appalled by the systematic and widespread violations of human rights and humanitarian law in Ukraine, amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity, overwhelmingly attributable to the Russian armed forces. The horrible pictures from Bucha, Mariupol, Kharkiv and other places in Ukraine have rendered us speechless. We are worried about the high number of civilian casualties in the conflict and stress in this respect the need for comprehensive, verifiable and transparent records of casualties. Liechtenstein strongly condemns the indiscriminate shelling and bombing of populated areas and the deliberate targeting of hospitals, schools and other civilian objects. We stress the importance of respecting human rights and humanitarian law in this conflict. We welcome the swift appointment of the members of the Commission of Inquiry as an important step to start the investigation into the crimes committed in Ukraine in view of holding the perpetrators of these crimes accountable. Moreover, we welcome the launch of an investigation into the situation in Ukraine by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate Liechtenstein's strong support for the Commission of Inquiry. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Noruega.
Thank you. I give the floor to Norway.
Thank you, Mr. President. Russia has chosen to start an unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. Norway condemns Russia's violation of international humanitarian law and violations and abuses of human rights. Norway calls on Russia to stop the deliberate targeting and destruction of civilian infrastructure, such as homes, hospitals and schools. There are abundant credible reports of arbitrary executions and torture of civilians, enforced disappearances and forced transfer of population to Russia, and the use of conflict-related sexual violence as a weapon of war. Such atrocities must be investigated and those responsible held to account. Norway supports the work of the OHCHR. We welcome the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry and urge all member states to ensure that it has sufficient financial resources and specialist expertise. Mr. President, Russia's invasion will have serious effects on global food security. The war has disrupted production and change of supply, and this will have a devastating impact on the most vulnerable people in all regions. This is Russia's responsibility. We urge Russia to stop the war. Russia must immediately, completely and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Syria.
Thank you. I give the floor to Syria.
Mr. President, Syria believes in the importance of the role of this Council in promoting and protecting human rights based on the principles of universality and objectivity, away from politicization and double standards. The convening of this special session only 2 months after the urgent debate of the Council on Ukraine and the recycling of the previously adopted resolution come in the context of a systematic Western campaign to defame the Russian Federation and to serve agendas that seem to escalate the situation in Ukraine and obstruct a peaceful situation. The Council's contribution to the settlement of the crisis requires addressing the human rights situation in Ukraine in a non-selective manner, abandoning the policy of ignoring the systematic violations of human rights and atrocities committed against civilians in Donbass, and recognizing that imposing illegal, unilateral, coercive measures against the Russian Federation and dumping Ukraine with lethal weapons and mercenaries confirm the tendency of Western countries to escalate the situation and continue to threaten Russia's national security. Syria considers that the holding of this special session and the draft resolution before it, which ignores these facts and seeks to selectively blame the Russian Federation, is a failed recipe to address human rights issues in a fair and non-discriminatory manner. We urge Council members to reject it. Thank you, sir.
Shukran.
Thank you. I give the floor to Bulgaria.
Gracias, Presidente. Bulgaria aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. Bulgaria has been consistently supporting the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders and stands firmly behind the Ukrainian people, the democratically elected institutions of Ukraine and their choice of a free and democratic Ukraine pursuing its European path. We reiterate our condemnation in the strongest possible terms of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, accompanied by gross human rights violations and breaches of international humanitarian law. We condemn the reported atrocities committed by the Russian armed forces in Ukraine. The attacks against the civilian population in Ukraine, the loss of lives, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure they bring are absolutely unacceptable and should be investigated. We urge the Human Rights Council to act swiftly at this session and to ensure that those responsible for violations and abuses of international human rights law and violations of international humanitarian law in Ukraine be held accountable. We expect the Commission of Inquiry created to this effect to become fully operational as soon as possible. We call on Russia to fully comply with its obligations under international humanitarian law and to ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian assistance and access to all those in need, including women, children, the elderly and the disabled. We are profoundly concerned that the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine has already led to the displacement of more than 13 million people. Bulgaria has received by now more than 230,000 Ukrainian refugees. We will continue to provide further support to the suffering people of Ukraine. For all these reasons, Bulgaria supported the convocation of this special session and calls on all Human Rights Council members to support the adoption of the draft resolution tabled by Ukraine. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Uruguay. Thank you, President. Uruguay follows with grave concern the human rights situation in Ukraine as a result of the military aggression by the Russian Federation. We reaffirm our firm condemnation of this flagrant violation of international law. We gravely regret the impact of the conflict on civilians, which include children whose lives and human rights have been unjustly affected. At the same time, we reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire and our support for continuing diplomatic efforts and negotiations as the only way to reach a swift solution that would allow and enable a lasting peace. Uruguay reaffirms its firm support for the Commission of Inquiry created by this Council in March. We trust it will be able to deliver on its important mandate independently and impartially, having access to all Ukrainian territory. We state our firm support also for the monitoring work that's been carried out by OHCHR and the Council's special procedures, echoing their concerns at the grave impact of the conflict on human rights. We trust the Council will be able to effectively deliver it on its important responsibilities with regards to this lamentable conflict, which will once again show the commitment that the majority of the community has to respect for international law and humanitarian law. Therefore, we support the draft resolution presented. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Turquía.
Thank you. I give the floor to Turkey.
Mr. President, we support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, including Crimea. We reject breaches of fundamental principles of the UN Charter and the military aggression on Ukraine. This war is wrong. It should not have started in the first place. Now we have all the terrible consequences of war, including great human suffering, death, and the violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, as documented by the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. We are also concerned by the long-term and broader consequences of the conflict on human rights in Ukraine and the world at large. The international community cannot afford the potential risks of such serious regional and even global complications. Images from various districts around Kiev, including Bucha and Irpin, as well as from Mariupol and other Ukrainian cities, are appalling. We share the pain of the people of Ukraine. Targeting innocent civilians and civilian infrastructure can never be accepted. Identifying perpetrators and bringing them to account through independent investigations are of utmost importance. Since the early days of the war, we have been seeking an humanitarian ceasefire and a way to open humanitarian corridors. We believe it is necessary to keep dialogue channels open for a peaceful solution and the easing of the humanitarian situation. We should do all we can to keep the diplomatic track going. Turkey will continue to work towards achieving peace without delay. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Croatia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Croatia aligns with the EU statement. Croatia continues its strong condemnation of the military aggression by Russia against Ukraine, which dramatically deteriorated human rights situation in the country. We are aware of Moscow's desperate attempts at justifying the unprovoked and unjustifiable invasion. However, nowadays it's much harder to hide war atrocities. We are appalled by numerous mass grave discoveries in liberated areas that were previously under control of Russian armed forces, including in Bucha. Allegations of hundreds of summary executions of civilians in towns in regions of Kiev, Chernihiv, Kharkiv and Sumy, as well as reports of torture, forced displacement and the use of rape as a weapon of war is extremely disturbing. We welcome the prompt commencement of the important work by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry and reiterate the High Commissioner's call for respect for international humanitarian law amid growing evidence of war crimes in Ukraine. We strongly support the request for the High Commissioner to prepare an update on the situation in Mariupol. Mr. President, Croatia stands with Ukraine and calls on other states to join the voices condemning the Russian act of aggression that breaches the principle of sovereign equality and the right to self-determination as agreed to in the UN Charter. We welcome all efforts in ensuring humanitarian corridors and we urge Russia to respect the international humanitarian law, to protect civilians and to respect sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Islandia, por favor.
Thank you. I give the floor to Iceland.
Thank you, Mr. President. IHL and the Geneva Conventions are clear on the do's and don'ts in international armed conflicts. Human rights law is also clear. We thus should not be having to reconvene today. But Russia's unimaginable violations and disregard for international law and the rules of war have made this essential. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has caused widespread destruction and unspeakable suffering of civilians in Ukraine, including of women and girls. We're witnessing torture and other ill treatment, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, and sexual and gender-based violence. In Bucha, Mariupol, and elsewhere, we've seen images of civilians executed and buried in mass graves. Civilians must never be a target, and every precaution must be taken to ensure their safety. There should be no impunity. The Commission of Inquiry will play a central role in collecting evidence and ensuring accountability for the crimes committed. We fully support the investigation launched by the ICC in the work of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine and other accountability mechanisms. These are necessary to ensure justice for victims, but also to prevent future violations. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Eslovenia.
Thank you. I give the floor to Slovenia.
Mr. President, Slovenia expresses its full support for the work of the High Commissioner, the Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. Slovenia is appalled by the past events in Ukraine caused by Russian unprovoked and unjustified attack that constitutes the most severe violation of the UN Charter. We urge Russia to immediately cease its military aggression. We also reiterate our call on Belarus to abide by its international obligations and stop supporting the Russian aggression. We express grave concern over numerous reports on growing number of civilian casualties, especially women, children, and older persons. My country is appalled by attacks on schools and hospitals, indiscriminate killings, torture, and the use of sexual violence as the weapons of war. These are war crimes. These are crimes against humanity. It is the duty of the international community to ensure full compliance with international human rights and humanitarian law and hold the perpetrators accountable for their violations. This is why comprehensive, independent, and unfettered examination of the events in the areas of Kiev, Cherniv, Kharkiv, and Sumy regions during their temporary occupation by the Russian Federation is urgently needed. Our thoughts are with Ukraine and its people. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I'll give the floor to Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. President. Cyprus aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. Cyprus remains deeply concerned by the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Ukraine caused by Russia's illegal invasion. We will keep echoing our solidarity to Ukraine and support for its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We call on the Russian Federation to immediately cease its military operations and withdraw its troops. We are abhorred by violations of international humanitarian and international human rights law as documented by the High Commissioner herself, such as civilian killings, including of women and children, enforced disappearances, torture, and sexual and gender-based violence. We are also alarmed by the destruction of civilian infrastructure, as well as by severe damage to cultural sites in Ukraine and looting of cultural property. Crimes must not be left unpunished. Accountability is an essential element of a rules-based international order. In this vein, we support the work of the Commission of Inquiry as well as the International Criminal Court in their work to investigate crimes so as to deliver justice for Ukraine. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra.
I'll give the floor to Vietnam.
Mr. President, Vietnam reaffirms its principled support for the settlement of international disputes by peaceful means in accordance with fundamental principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Parties to the dispute should persevere in finding a long-term peaceful solution on the basis of these principles while taking into due account legitimate interests and concerns of all sides. We once again raise our objection to concerns over all forms of attack against civilian population in violation of international humanitarian and human rights law, especially attacks that result in large civilian casualties or damage to critical civilian infrastructure. Vietnam welcomes the humanitarian assistance that the United Nations and the international community have extended to the people of Ukraine. In a neutral, fair, and transparent manner, we are willing to take part in these efforts. In this regard, the government of Vietnam would provide about $500,000 in humanitarian aid to Ukraine, and this fund would be channeled through international organizations. Finally, we echo the growing call for prompt, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to an evacuation of people affected by the conflict in Ukraine, including foreign nationals. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra España.
Thank you. I give the floor to Spain. Thank you, President. Spain aligns with a statement by the EU. Spain reiterates its firm condemnation of the Russian aggression against Ukraine and the appalling violations of international law and international IHL. Information we've received from humanitarian agencies and the OHCHR observation mission are alarming. Women and children have borne the brunt of this war. Spain is very troubled at the genuine danger of them being victims of exploitation and trafficking, as a number of UN agencies have warned. Attacks against schools and hospitals are a flagrant violation of IHL, and we demand immediate cessation thereof. Peace in Ukraine will be impossible without justice for the victims. Spain will support all efforts to ensure that the perpetrators of those acts are held accountable. With more than 40 countries, we've supported the inquiry by the ICC. We also support the work being carried out by the OHCHR observation mission, as well as by the Commission of Inquiry established by this Council. All those efforts should be coordinated and be mutually reinforcing so that the investigations are effective, adopting a victim-centred approach so that the atrocities don't go unpunished. This war of aggression recalls us the need to continue to protect the principles of IHL, human rights and the values that underpin the international order. Therefore, we urge the Russian Federation to fully, immediately cease its aggression and to deliver on its obligations under international law. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Grecia.
Thank you. I'll give the floor to Greece.
Gracias, Presidente. Greece fully aligns itself with the EU statement. We are now 3 months into the unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And today we have heard of shocking atrocities committed, rising civilian casualties, unabated human suffering, and wide-scale destruction of vital infrastructure. Greece unequivocally condemns and rejects Russia's ongoing aggression and military occupation of Ukrainian territory. We condemned all actions that may amount to war crimes taking place in besieged cities in Ukraine, and in particular in Mariupol, home to a centuries-old Greek community, 120,000 strong, that suffers immensely as we speak. Greece is appalled by the serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in Ukraine. In that vein, we welcome the investigation launched by the International Criminal Court prosecutor. We also support the Commission of Inquiry and its work. We stress the need for cooperation among states, civil society and international mechanisms in order to ensure that perpetrators of all violations will be held to account. Excellencies, we call on Russia to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and abide by the principles of international humanitarian and human rights law. All crimes should not go unpunished. We stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. And the last speaker this morning, Timor-Leste has the floor.
Muito obrigada, Sr. Presidente. Timor-Leste welcomes the organization of this special session on the deteriorating human rights situation in Ukraine stemming from Russian aggression. 78 days have passed since Russia invaded Ukraine, and it is the second time this year that the Council is addressing the deteriorating human rights situation in Ukraine. As a country that knows firsthand that war brings benefit to no one, Timor-Leste is saddened that peace and ceasefire have not been achieved in Ukraine. Timor-Leste condemns the violations and abuses of human rights and serious breaches of international humanitarian law happening in Ukraine. In this respect, we call on all parties to the conflict to immediately cease military hostilities, refrain from using violence against civilians and targeting civilian objects. Timor-Leste reiterates its urgent call for the respect of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Timor-Leste reaffirms its strong commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, territorial integrity and unity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and reiterates its call on Russia to immediately and unconditionally withdraw all its military forces from the territory of Ukraine. Timor-Leste welcomes the establishment and appointment of the members of the Commission of Inquiry and supports the work of the Commission in undertaking a comprehensive and independent special inquiry aiming to hold to account those responsible. Mr. President, I wish to conclude this statement by reiterating Timor-Leste's appeal for peace, dialogue and an immediate ceasefire. I thank you.
Muito obrigado. Hemos llegado.
That brings us to the end of this morning's meeting. We will meet here once again at 3 p.m. for the continuation of our debate. Taking action on the draft resolution, I declare closed the first section of the 34th Extraordinary Session of the Human Rights Council.